This is the second half of our lecture of Italy in the 15th century. And previous to this, we had looked at some architecture, we had looked at some sculpture, and we had also talked about this one guy, Filippo Brunelleschi, who is going to be the one who gives us linear perspective. And during the 15th century, we have to consider how important the illusion of space is. In 1435, Leon Battista Alberti publishes his book called On Painting, where he states that, quote, looking at a painting should be the same as looking out a window. Now, of course, we have looking out a window as a three-dimensional element, and a painting is two-dimensional. So artists have had to come up with illusionary practices or techniques in order to accomplish this. We have some that are real easy. For instance, scale, overlapping, vertical placement. Any one of us can do that fairly simply. However, when we start adding the word perspective, the technique becomes much more complex, but it also becomes a lot more realistic. So we'll take a look at atmospheric, linear, and amplified perspective. Now with scale, that's pretty easy. Objects closer to us appear larger than those farther away. When we look at the tree at the left-hand side, it appears closest to us because it is larger than the rest of the trees in that row. And as they diminish in size, we kind of just continue on watching them as they go back into the road, literally bringing us into the painting. Even though the tree at the left is no further away than the tree at the right is. They're both the same distance from us. But when we alter the scale, we give that illusion of space. This happens in real life. When we have these people who are roughly the same size lined up, we can see that they diminish in size the farther they are away. And so we take this optical illusion that we have in real life and we really realize how imperfect our eyesight is when we start looking at these techniques. With overlapping, it states that objects closer to us cover or hide objects that are farther away. So in the bottom left-hand corner of this painting, we have a bottle of apple juice, and it covers up some of the Fiji water bottle behind it. The same at the right-hand side of the painting, where we have the distinctive Perrier bottle covering up part of the Evian bottle. Objects closer to us hide objects that are farther away from us. We also have vertical placement, which states that the higher the object is, the farther away it is. So in this collage, we have a pork roast and some cans of coffee at the lowest part of the image, and that is closest to us. The next row up contains beer and a camera and soda further away from us, and then yet further away from that are the lemon and the apple that appear to be on the windowsill. We don't see this a lot in Western art. In fact, where we see it mostly is in Eastern art. For instance, this Japanese screen of irises, we can see how the landscape is created by the use of vertical placement. The higher the object is, the further away it is from us. Now, when we start to add the word perspective, things get a lot more interesting. Now, with the definitions that I give you throughout the semester, they're not that important in terms of memorizing. For instance, this definition is pretty dense. It states, as forms recede into the background, their contours become less distinct, and colors begin to take on the color of the atmosphere. You don't ever have to repeat this definition on an exam or anything like that, but you have to be able to utilize it. You have to be able to identify what it is that is atmospheric perspective. So when you see an image like this, you can say definitively yes or no, this is or isn't an atmospheric perspective. And here it absolutely is. The definition stated, as forms recede into the background, their contours become less distinct. And we can see a very crisp, a very clear foreground. The colors are sharp. We can almost count the amount of pine needles that are on the tree. But as the mountain ranges go back, we can see that the contours are less distinct. And the colors begin to take on the colors of the atmosphere. That mountain that we see in the far distance is not at all blue when we get to it. It's going to be as green as the foreground is. Again, this is an optical illusion that our eyes present to us. And artists replicate this in paintings so that they look authentic. Atmospheric perspective is created not only in color but also in black and white. And here we have it seen in a painting of the Rocky Mountains. So again, artists replicate this in order to create a very lifelike, how we would normally see with our eyes, a landscape, and believe it to be authentic. Now, amplified perspective is also called foreshortening. In fact, it's more commonly called foreshortening. Here, an artist reduces or distorts parts of an object, but still conveys the illusion of three-dimensionality. I'm going to tell you about linear perspective next. And the idea of linear perspective is it's a mathematical formula for creating three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. But with foreshortening, what we do with that is we actually, in this case of the dead Christ, we've reduced parts of the torso and the legs. We've propped the figure up a little bit vertically. So we're eliminating the idea of linear perspective. And foreshortening is, first of all, very difficult for the artist to create where it looks lifelike. But its intention is to bring viewers very quickly into the artwork at a very unique angle. There's no other painting I know of where we're really positioned at the feet of Christ. And this painting would have been placed in a small chapel. You would sit in front of it and literally dwell on the wounds of Christ. If Christ had been painted correctly, we wouldn't have been able to see his body because his feet would have been in the way. And again, foreshortening is very rare. We do see it a little bit in photography also when we get to that segment of the course. But again, it's a very unique angle and brings the viewers in very quickly to the scene. So now we're going to spend some time talking about linear perspective, and this is one of the most important elements we need to take away from this chapter. Linear perspective is the most convincing way of representing three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. And when it was codified in the early 1400s, around 1428, it revolutionized art. It became the gold standard that artists had to live up to, and at least until 1863, and that marks the beginning of the modern art era. And we'll talk about that, the transition away from linear perspective later on. But it is incredibly important. It's something that is still taught today. The theory of linear perspective is actually really simple. Parallel lines appear to converge on or emerge from a single point in the distance, and that point is called the vanishing point. Linear perspective is great because it's a math equation, it's a formula, and so we can all follow it, but again, it's a math formula, and we only have one correct answer to math formulas. So everything has to be correct or the entire artwork is thrown off. So the best way to describe linear perspective is through the use of railroad tracks. We all know railroad tracks are parallel. Otherwise, trains would fall off the tracks. But here, the tracks look like they're converging on that point in the distance, and that point is the vanishing point. And so it provides us with a very unique conundrum. If we're riding on this train, if we're the engineer going at 100 miles an hour, and this is an image taken up in the Alaskan wilderness, what do? Do you trust your eyesight that the tracks are coming together and you need to pull the emergency brake? Or do you trust your brain that, hey, it's telling you this is an optical illusion and these tracks are truly parallel? The first step of linear perspective is to create a horizon line. And the horizon line, of course, is where the sky and the land meet. It's one of the only rectilinear or straight lines that we see in nature. The line is arbitrary. It can be up high or down low. It can be in the center of the image. And keep in mind that the horizon line will extend past the frame infinitely in either direction. So we start off with an artwork and we create the horizon line. Again, that's just a horizontal line anywhere on the surface of the canvas or paper. In this image, the horizon line is up rather high, but in this image, the horizon line is much lower in the bottom third of the image. After we've established the horizon line, we establish the vanishing point. And again, like the horizon line, the vanishing point is an arbitrary point. It can be in the center of the work, which is very common on scenes, for instance, of the Last Suppers. We would call this frontal recession. If it's off to the left or off to the right, it's called diagonal recession, and those are just minor elements. The vanishing point is going to be where all parallel lines converge, and that's the important point here. So again, back to our diagram, we have the horizon line established. The vanishing point lives on the horizon line. As you see here, it's in the center. This would be frontal recession. If it was off to the left or right, whether a little bit or a lot, it would be considered diagonal recession. And the difference that it makes in an image is like this. Frontal recession at the left, diagonal recession at the right. Even though these are train tracks, it gives us an incredibly different viewpoint of the world. Now, step 3 is the most difficult. This is what people have problems with, that all parallel lines need to converge on or emerge from the vanishing point. And so this is the Church of Santa Maria Novella. And as you enter and you walk down toward the altar on the left-hand side, we have the Holy Trinity by Masaccio. And Masaccio is one of the most important painters of the 15th century. In fact, this is an artist who Michelangelo is inspired by. As far as Masaccio is concerned, he creates the very first image in linear perspective. Now, he doesn't invent linear perspective. That's Brunelleschi. But he creates the very first artwork that's done in linear perspective. And when we look at the image here, we have at the right all the individual components of the image, including the patrons who are just outside of the barrel vault. The patrons are members of the Lindsay family, and these are people who paid for this artwork to be created. The way we prove something is in linear perspective is actually in reverse to how we create it. So it's kind of like a geometry proof in a way. With the barrel vault that we see above the crucifixion, that's an architectural element that we can see the coffered ceiling and the lines. And if we took a pencil and a ruler and trace those, as we did in the image at the right, we can see that all those lines meet at one single point called the vanishing point. And the vanishing point therefore establishes where the horizon line is, which is where members of the Lindsay family are kneeling. And so, of course, we can say that this work is absolutely in linear perspective. Now, one way of kind of cheating the proof is that anything really established, created after the 1430s, is going to be in linear perspective. It had to be. Last lecture, we talked about how objects were in mimesis, the idea of trying to replicate or reproduce nature, and that's what artists are, that's what their goal is. And so here they are reproducing nature as efficiently as possible. Prior to linear perspective, in this painting by Giotto, we can see that the buildings here look pretty funky. There's no established architecture. It looks like some of them are anywhere close to near collapsing. And when we draw lines from the parallel features, we can see that they're not parallel, that they just kind of go haphazardly from one side of the painting to the other. They don't meet at a single point. And so that's why the architecture looks like this. Now, of course, this image with the Last Supper, just by looking at it, we can say that it's in linear perspective because it looks like a three-dimensional space, even though it's on a flat surface. And so here we can again prove by doing lines from the coffered ceiling or the doorways on either side, even the edges of the table and the tile flooring. All of those lines can match up to the center of Christ's forehead, and that gives us where the horizon line is. Even in a work like this, a landscape scene, again, we can draw lines and say that the edges of the street, the sidewalk, even the park benches and the trees appear to be planted in linear perspective along that one single line, creating a vanishing point. In this case, the vanishing point is off to the left. We have a work that's in diagonal recession, so it creates a totally different balance to the work than a work like the Last Supper would, which is a much more symmetrical work. Now, whereas linear perspective with one point is very basic, artists quickly created a second vanishing point so that they could turn and twist objects. In the image at the left, where there's just one vanishing point, we have a very frontal scene, but with the image at the right, we can turn that box different degrees. And here's some examples of some different boxes that are done in two-point perspective. This is a much more current painting, I believe from the 1960s, by Ed Ruscha, and he creates this image of the standard station that is absolutely in linear perspective. The image at the right, or excuse me, the vanishing point at the right can be traced from the roof line down to the horizon, which you see is very, very low in this image. That's why we have an image that we look as if we're an ant crawling along the ground looking up at this gas station. But the vanishing point at the left is well off the canvas, and that is okay because remember the horizon line extends past the edge of the canvas. And by just looking at this work, knowing it's at an angle, we can say absolutely this is two-point linear perspective. And Ruscha loves to create images of this gas station both during the day and at night. This one's on fire, and one of my favorite ones is this one. It's the double standard. So with this image here, we're going to look at all the different ways of creating the illusion of space. The first one, of course, was scale. Objects closer to us look larger than objects further away. The people that are heading right toward us with the umbrella are very, very large in scale. The guy walking to the left of the couple is smaller, and the couple to the left of that is smaller yet. Overlapping occurs with the two images at the left-hand side. We have vertical placement. Again, you can see that these individuals are walking at different heights of the canvas. And then with linear perspective, the building in the background that's kind of pointed toward us is done in two-point perspective. And again, we can trace the different levels of the floors to two vanishing points, and that would also give us where the horizon line is. And so that's where I'm going to stop this video. We're going to have one more video that covers the 15th century, and we're going to look at a few more artworks there.